Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today for the Public-Private Partnerships, Drivers for Civic and Social Infrastructure webinar. I'm Michael Catsi. I'm the Business Development and Communications Director at the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority and the moderator for today's webinar. I'm very happy to be part of today's event. P3s are really interesting procurement and financing mechanisms, so I'm looking forward to the discussion. And just a little bit of background about me. I am a certified economic developer and certified development finance professional. I have 15 years experience in economic development, working in local, regional and statewide organizations, and I am an IEDC board member at the moment. The past 8 years I've been working for ADOT, which is the Development Finance Authority for the state of Alaska, and we are a $1.3 billion public corporation that supports economic development in the state by deploying capital through a number of different programs. So today's session will provide best practices in using P3s for civic and social infrastructure. While we've seen P3s predominantly used for transportation and other horizontal infrastructure projects in the past, they are increasingly being used for vertical infrastructure these days. We have two great speakers today. Two people I've had the pleasure of sharing a panel with in the past on P3s, John Finke of Public Facilities Group and Gail Lewis of the Arizona Department of Transportation, both of whom I will introduce further into the session. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. During the webinar, we will have all lines muted. So if you have any questions, please type those questions into the question box on your screen, and I will ask our presenters those questions during the Q&A period, which is at the end of the presentations. Also, within 24 hours, you should be receiving an email with an electronic evaluation. Please complete it as IEDC staff uses the feedback to plan future sessions. And furthermore, you will receive a link to download the presentations at the end of the evaluation. So what I'd like to do at this point is to give you a high-level overview of P3s so that we're all on the same page as to what they are and what they do and what they don't do before the speakers begin with their presentations. Bit of a delay. There we go. So one thing I want to do straight off the bat here is define what a public-private partnership is. And while there is no one definition, I did pull up a couple of different definitions, one from the National Council for Public-Private Partnerships in the US. And this is a really good definition, and I've highlighted some of what I think are the key points of a P3. And they really are contractual agreements between a public entity and a private sector entity in the procurement and financing of public infrastructure. And the second bullet point here really focuses on what one of the benefits of a P3 is the fact that you actually share in the risks, and the entity that is best capable of handling those risks handles those risks. And again, everything that a P3 finances and procures is really for public infrastructure. And the next definition that I picked out is from PPP Canada. That's the federal agency in Canada for public-private partnerships. And what I liked about their definition was it focused on the performance portion of a P3 contract, and I think that's critical. And it's really, again, focused on the it's a procurement of public infrastructure. Again, it talks about the shifting of some of the risk onto the private sector entities. And at the bottom, it says from design and planning to long-term maintenance. These are long-term sort of construction, financing, and operations contracts. And this sort of takes in the whole gamut of the life cycle of the project. So what is a P3 not? They're not three. A lot of people have the misconception that if the private sector does it, then the public sector is not paying for it. That's not true at all. Free is a grant or an appropriation, and that's not what P3s are about. And it's also not a silver bullet. Not every project you are contemplating will fit into the P3 model, and it may not be appropriate to do a P3 for that particular project. There's a misconception as well that P3s are an asset sale or the privatization of a public asset. At no point in a P3 arrangement does the public sector lose control of the asset. They may contract out the maintenance, they may contract out the financing and other portions of the operations, but it always remains in the public sector's hands. So when we talk about a P3 transaction, under the traditional municipal finance approach, the public entity was responsible for bidding out the design and the build, and then the operations and the maintenance and financing of the project. Under a P3, the public entity can decide which of those functions it wishes to transfer over to the private sector for whatever reasons. They feel like the private sector can do a better job on those pieces than they can. So when we look at the next slide, we'll see that there's a sort of a spectrum of delivery for services and projects. On the left-hand side, you'll see the traditional public sector procurement and financing mechanisms. We see design, bid, build, design, build. These are traditional public sector financing and construction. On the far right side, we see the privatization. That is when the private sector is essentially selling off its assets to the public sector, selling off its assets to the private sector. And what we're focusing on in this webinar is really the piece in the middle, the orange piece, where the public entity maintains control of the asset, but certain parts of its functionality have been transferred over to the private sector. So these are a list of objectives that you would hope to get one or more of these. That's a reason for doing a P3, and this is what you would hope to get out of it. Any number of these sort of works for a successful P3, but I really want to highlight the last point there. And I know John and Gail will go into a little bit more detail about this. That's promoting the life cycle of an asset. The traditional public procurement system really focuses on the construction of a project. It doesn't really take into consideration the whole life cycle. If you have an asset, if you're building an asset that's going to last 50 years, the public sector model really focuses on that first piece, which is the construction. And in most cases, the construction cost is really only between 25 and 35% of the project costs over the life cycle. By not taking into consideration those life cycle costs, you're not considering anywhere between 50 and 70% of the cost of the project. You're really only focused on the construction, and that means that you could end up paying a lot more in the long term. So when we talk about civic and social infrastructure, these are the types of projects that we're talking about. Again, we're not talking about your roads and highways and things like that. These are sort of more vertical infrastructure, buildings and other types of infrastructure that really, again, is focused on public services and public good. There's a wide range, and in particular, we've seen a really big uptick in the use of P3s for university student dorms and housing right across the country. A lot of the state university systems have now moved over to using P3s to put these deals together. And how do you make the decision on whether to use a traditional public methodology or use a P3 And the only way you can actually do that is to actually compare the two. So you need to do a value for money analysis on both processes. You can't just do it on one or the other. You need to do it on both processes. And then when you get to the end of that, you can actually make a cost comparison of what makes more sense, whether to go with the traditional procurement financing model or whether to focus on a P3. And at that point, you need to work out how much of that risk you're willing to transfer over to the private sector. So based on that, I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page so that we know what we're talking about when we talk about P3s or PPPs. And I'm now going to hand it over to John Finke. John is the president of the Public Facilities Group, which is a nationally recognized non-profit specializing in P3 delivery of public facilities. The Public Facilities Group uses the new American approach for P3 delivery, and John has completed 28 projects using this approach with a total cost of $2 billion. Additionally, John lectures at the graduate level in public-private partnerships at the University of Washington Real Estate College of Built Environments. Prior to forming Public Facilities Group, John founded and led the P3 program at the National Development Council. John, we're glad to have you today. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And I thought the points you made, Michael, for our audience were fabulous points. Far too often I run into people that sort of think that there's magic there. And this stuff is all about practical delivery of public infrastructure, vertical public infrastructure. And it's really science, it's not magic. You want to marry the efficiencies that are there within the private sector and within the public sector. And it's hard delivery concepts that need to be properly applied. So let's start into it. As Michael said, we are a national not-for-profit. Our purpose is public purpose to help the public sector understand and properly use the P3 tool. And as Michael mentioned, we've done a lot of it. Right now, I'm deep into the sort of completion of design and starting the finance phase of a 500,000 square foot building for Los Angeles County, a police facility for Salinas, and a fairly small library for Salinas, California. So it's very exciting doing these projects. They're a lot of fun, and they're very rewarding in the sense that you can align the public and the private interests in many areas and use the best of both approaches. When we do it, we use quite often, well, we always use tax-exempt bonds to finance our projects. And I'll talk a little bit about our model with tax-exempt bonds and a debt equity model in later slides. But the approach we use most often is a 6320 bond, which is a U.S. Lease revenue bond named for a letter ruling in 1963, the 20th letter ruling. There's a revenue procedure that sort of pulls together all the provisions of 6320. It's revenue procedure 8226 if you want to go offline afterwards and look it up. Or we use 501c3 bonds, lease revenue bonds issued by a conduit issuer for a 501c3 such as us. Our function is to be an on behalf of owning the project for the term of the debt, and then returning the project to the public ownership whenever the public sector wants the fee title. The public sector controls it through a long-term lease, and then we use private property management. So that's quickly the model we use. I'll talk a little bit about more of that. Here's a slide, as I said earlier, partly for Michael, since it's an Alaska slide. It's the first Alaskan P3 project that was completed. It's, and I think for everybody, it's an example of a fairly small P3 project. Often when you read the literature, when you talk and see P3 projects, you see very, very large projects. And there's a sort of belief out there that the P3 tool is a tool for the 300 million, 400 million, 500 million or larger facility. That is just not accurate. We have done many projects in the under $100 million range. My personal rule of thumb for a P3 is about a $20 million project or up. The smallest one I ever did was 7 million, but that was 20 plus years ago. And I suspect 7 million today would be 20 million, or 7 million then would be 20 million today. So my rule again, about 20 million is the smallest social infrastructure P3 you want to undertake. This one was a really glorious project. It has received many, many awards for its efficiency, for its environmental sustainability, and for its beauty and functionality. It's a multiple award-winning project, a dining facility for the University of Alaska Fairbanks. This is another sort of modest project, $44 million, and it demonstrates the purpose of a P3. It's privately managed. It's very efficient in management. It was very efficient in cost. It came in under budget, $4.2 million under budget. It came in under the expected, not only under budget, but it came in under, fairly dramatically under the expected cost that the public agency, which was the County of Riverside in California, expected the cost to be. And it came in, frankly, at a higher lead standard. We were asked to do silver. We told them that for the same price we would do gold, and we actually did it in platinum at a lower cost than the budget called for. So beautiful building in Indio, California for the County of Riverside. This is the larger side of the equation. This is one building of 5 on a campus that we've done. A total of 800,000 square feet. When it all gets finished, there's one more building under construction right now. It's a biomedical research facility and a biomedical research campus for the University of Washington. This one was very interesting in that the School of Medicine, who's the tenant of the building, did a post-occupancy analysis of the building. And on simply the cost of delivery, they came in with an estimate of 14 to 29% lower cost than a comparison building that the University of Washington was building themselves at the same time. Another laboratory building or research building, molecular engineering building, that was built by the school itself at the same time. And our building, which was substantially larger, more than twice as large as the comparison building, came in 14 months faster in delivery. The buildings were of comparable quality, they were of comparable complexity, and the point I generally make in P3 delivery on the facility cost side of the equation, you can get buildings of equal and often better quality and get them faster. And the important thing about faster is faster directly equates to lower cost, because your tower crane is there for a shorter period of time. Your general conditions are on the project for a shorter period of time. Your capitalized or construction interest is there for a shorter period of time. So if you can shorten the delivery time without diminishing quality, you can save dramatically on cost. And few governments really deeply understand the direct relationship between cost and time. And the principal difference between public and private delivery is in the time of delivery, in the experience and ability to quickly make decisions to move the project on faster. And properly structured, a good P3 will deliver buildings faster, and because of that, at a lower cost. Okay, key considerations in a P3. Often you hear conversations about, and this especially applies to social infrastructure, and there are horizontal infrastructure situations, which like toll roads and that it applies less to. But for a social infrastructure, building a building for a government, there is no lack of availability of capital. It's a very important point. There is no capital gap. The second point is the critical one here. There is a revenue issue, whether it is availability of revenue or allocation of revenue. When I say revenue, what I'm really saying is the ability of the user of that building to have and pay rent. If the user, if the government that is going to occupy the building can pay rent, there is no lack of availability, publicly or privately, of capital to do it. The issue really is allocation and availability of revenue. The P3 for social infrastructure essentially builds buildings, leases those buildings to a government, and then transfers the property to a government. And the important factor, which we just mentioned, is the government pays rent. The rent covers costs of paying for the construction of the building and the operations of the building. So what's important in a P3 structure is how you structure the contracts and how you structure the lease and how you structure the transfer and how you structure the operations and maintenance. And in doing that, how you select the best approaches to each of those items. So a successful P3 in social infrastructure is a P3 that can deliver the lowest cost of the facility, the highest quality of the facility, and the greatest efficiency in long-term operations and maintenance of the facility. Here's sort of a fairly complicated graphic. If you go down to between the second and the third square on the left-hand side, right under design build, I could have put in design or construction management at risk, but those first two columns are essentially public delivery columns. The most public facilities are still done with design, bid, build. We're now seeing a lot of design build approaches, and we're seeing some construction manager at risk approaches, which is sort of a hybrid in there. And the important thing, and the thing that is seldom focused on, is all public facilities are built privately. If you look at that second column over the construction column, they're just in social infrastructure and public buildings. It is private contractors that always do the construction. So the issue is, in a P3, you're going beyond that. And I've got 3 boxes to illustrate, 3 lines to illustrate approaches to P3. Design, build, finance, where the public runs the operation and maintenance of it. Design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, which I've broken into 2 different approaches. One that uses tax-exempt financing, and one that uses usually equity and debt, and an availability payment model for maintenance. And we'll go through each of those in a minute. But before we get there, another important element is why P3 for development itself. And the idea here is you're going to bring in a team usually comprising of a contractor, an architect, or an engineers, and a developer to design and deliver the building. Why private development? Because they work more efficiently. Governments don't build buildings very often. If you're from a city, think of the last time you built a city hall or a municipal office building. The same for a county. These things don't happen often, and the in-house skills are not there. Governments generally turn to consultants when they do it themselves, and consultants are not the best assistance you can get. So the P3 delivers with developers that have the in-house experience. They know how to control costs, and if you set it up right, they will be incentivized to deliver it efficiently. The 2 approaches that are most common in the P3 model are an exempt financing approach, which we call the New American approach, and a taxable financing approach, which is most often called performance-based or availability-based approach. The 2 differ in significant but minor ways. The exempt or the American approach uses tax-exempt financing, which is 100% financing. It's debt at the lowest cost because it is exempt from federal taxes. The coverage ratio is 1.0 because there's no equity. It's a single loan that covers construction and long-term financing, and it is something that the bond market finds in essential government buildings a greater ease at dealing with government leases that handle appropriation or require appropriation and abatement language. The taxable approach is a combination of debt and equity. The taxable debt is a little bit more, maybe 100 basis points, or depending on the structure, 100 basis points more than exempt financing. But equity, just like Mike mentioned a few minutes ago, when he said it's not free, you've got to understand that equity is not free either. Equity is the most expensive form of financing in a capital stack, 2-3 times higher than debt. So the availability payment approach brings in private equity, and there's value to private equity. It keeps people focused on their risk, but it is a very expensive source. So the capital stack in the availability approach is a blend of the percentage of debt plus the percentage of equity to give you a return. The debt coverage ratio, which is the rent that must be paid to service the debt, is higher because it also needs to give a return to the equity. So 1.1 or higher for the debt coverage ratio. These deals are done with two loans, a construction loan and a takeout loan. If you're going to do one, make sure you look at who gets the proceeds in the permanent loan that takes out the construction loan, because the permanent loan comes onto a project after the building is built and occupied. It is normal for that permanent loan to be a larger loan than the construction loan, and you want to participate in the proceeds of that loan that go beyond paying off the construction loan. There's a much greater difficulty in dealing with appropriation language and abatement language in conventional financing. Approaches to management. The American approach differs from the availability of payment approach in an interesting way. Both of them require that the building be maintained in a like-new condition for the life of the financing or the life of the agreement with the public agency. The American approach handles that by a series of 3 to 5 year property management agreements. And those property management agreements are bid or renewed at the public agency's desire. So the owner, the not-for-profit, hires the private property managers, puts them on a competitive basis, meeting the terms that the public agency wants, and bids them out. The availability payment approach, the team that built it engages a property manager for a 30 to 50 year period that maintains the building, and most commonly uses a availability payment approach, which basically in a legal set of legal documents slices and dices the building into components like conference rooms and elevators and offices, and says if any of those are not available, the base payment, which covers full operations and maintenance over the long term, is then reduced by a specific dollar amount assigned to a conference room not being available or a bathroom not being available. So it becomes a very complicated negotiation, but it is a long-term negotiation. Because of that long-term arrangement and the way they have traditionally been structured, the IRS says you cannot use tax-exempt financing on an availability or performance-based contract, which then brings it back to why these projects are financed with debt and equity, because the long-term operating agreement by the IRS is equivalent in the IRS's terms to ownership. It prohibits tax-exempt financing. When we do it, we use a progressive development model, which basically says we're going to design the building to the point that the development team can give a guaranteed maximum price to the not-for-profit owner that says we will build it for this or less. So we contract with the government agency to design the building. So it's a design process that involves the developer, the general contractor, the architect, the not-for-profit, and most importantly, the public agency in designing the project to either completion of design development or into construction drawings. At that point, the development team will give us a guaranteed maximum price, give us a guaranteed time of delivery. We'll stand behind that with liquidated damages, and we will move to financing. You can finance these facilities with the GMP, with the guarantees, with the entitlements completed, and with a lease to the public agency. The construction phase insulates the public agency from cost overruns. So there's a real risk transfer here from the public agency taking the risk in a normal public delivery to the private parties taking the risk of cost overruns in delivery. So risk transfer, insulating the public agency from that risk. And with the not-for-profit tax-exempt bonds financing, the public or the private team builds and delivers the project. The lease, which is signed at financing, doesn't kick in. There's no obligation to pay rent until the building is delivered as designed. And when the lease kicks in, the public agency controls it through a lease for the life of the debt and has the right to pay off that debt whenever they choose. And when they pay it off, they get the fee title to the building at no cost. Once the building is up and operating, the lease payments cover debt service, they cover the operating costs, and they cover repair and replacement reserve to keep the building in like-new condition. This is the same package that either of these two models, the American approach or the availability payment approach, uses. Debt service plus operating costs plus repair and maintenance is the rental obligation of the agency. Those payments go to a trustee. Their rent pays the debt service on the bonds. Rent pays the operating costs, the security, the janitorial, the utilities, and then the repair and replacement reserve is there to maintain the building in like-new condition. The special purpose operator hires the owner hires the operator on a long-term basis, and that results in a life cycle costing of the building for the public agency. Public agencies could maintain buildings in like-new conditions, but for many, many reasons, they make shortcuts and don't do it. So this, because each building is leased to a government on a long-term basis with requirements of that lease, that the government makes the contribution to repair and replacement, you end up with a life cycle approach. And in my definition of what life cycle costing is, it is finding the most efficient cost of money, the lowest cost of money, the greatest efficiency in delivery, the greatest efficiency in operations, and an active required maintenance. And add them all up, you get like new buildings for the life of the project. And I think with that, Michael, I'm done.
Great, thank you, John. Before we go on to our next speaker, I do want to remind people that the presentations themselves will be available. You should be receiving an email within the next 24 hours asking you to evaluate the webinar. And once that the evaluation is, once you finish the evaluation, there'll be a link to the presentations. Our next speaker is Gail Lewis. She's the Director of the Office of P3 Initiatives and International Affairs at the Arizona Department of Transportation. Gail leads the agency's effort to implement public-private partnerships as an alternative project delivery and finance mechanism, including project management, project pipeline development, management of the ADOT and consultant teams, and specific project management. In addition, she also oversees all of the department's border-related planning, policies, projects, and initiatives, and represents ADOT's interests with the state's colleagues and counterparts in Mexico. Gail previously spent a decade as the Director of Economic Development and Constituent Outreach for Arizona State University and worked for 2 Phoenix mayors. She's active with many national and local civic groups and is a past board member of IEDC. Gail, delighted to have you. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I want to thank Michael and John for doing a great job of setup for me. As Michael mentioned, I am a past IEDC board member, so I'm very dedicated to this organization and really interested in exploring the linkages between infrastructure and economic development. And I think P3s are a good way to start that conversation in a lot of ways. ADOT is the regular state highway agency for the state of Arizona. We are highway developers. We're very engineering driven. So it's a pretty traditional organization. And if we can figure out how to use alternative procurement, you can figure out how to use alternative procurement because we're a pretty traditional agency, and we have found P3s to offer a great deal of advantages for project delivery that I think are applicable whether you're doing social infrastructure or more traditional or transportation infrastructure. So I'll try and draw those parallels along the way. I also have found P3s to be a fantastic way to bring the private sector into project development at phases where we would normally not interact with the private sector, where it would be much more public sector driven. And I have found that approach to be very positive. So hopefully these lessons will come out and others will agree that there are a number of benefits through using P3s and not only the very specifics of project delivery. The rationale for using P3s in transportation, this will not come as a big surprise to most of you. Transportation is quite underfunded in the US. On the federal level, the last time the gas tax was raised was about 25 years ago. And Arizona is also one of those states that hasn't had a gas tax increase in 25 years. So it has been stuck at 18 cents a gallon, which 18 cents just doesn't buy what it used to. And in addition, as cars become, and trucks also become more and more efficient, the use of gasoline is going down. So it's been a double hit for transportation agencies. So we, as a result, we have become very interested in finding more efficient ways to fund, finance, and deliver transportation going forward. There's also been a tendency to prioritize new projects over maintenance. There are a lot of reasons for that. New projects are a lot more exciting and interesting, and you can cut a ribbon, and there's a photo op, and no one wants a photo op when you start a repaving project. And in fact, people are usually mad at you because you have to close a lane to do the work. Also, for those of us that use federal funds for transportation, you can use federal funds for new construction, but in few cases can you use federal funds for maintenance. So that means all the emphasis on maintenance, or all the burden of maintenance, falls to the local community or to the state. And that, again, makes it really challenging. So again, for all those reasons, very important to think about alternative delivery methods that take the long-term life cycle and maintenance and operations into account for a project. P3s are increasingly being used across all sorts of modes: highways, transit, air, sea, and also ancillary projects that are related to the core infrastructure, like lighting and rest areas, and also buildings and facilities. So I'm going to try and briefly talk about some of those options. The traditional delivery approach really does not take into account the long-term life cycle. So there are a number of reasons for including the life cycle in the approach. First, it lets you know at the very beginning that the project is being constructed in a way that will maximize the value and life of the asset. And second, by entering into a long-term contract, you have considered the cost of maintenance all the way through the project, and you plan for those needs, which is a very different way, again, than a traditional design, bid, build approach. Both Mike and John both talked about risk shifting. In the infrastructure field, when you construct things for a living and you're using a traditional design, bid, build, or a low bid approach, you're really on the hook for everything. You're on the hook for the construction, you're on the hook for the design, you're on the hook for the schedule delays, and you're on the hook if a contractor uses a cheaper material or a less expensive approach that may get them the low bid award, but does not consider the long-term life cycle of the process. So alternative delivery, the whole spectrum from design build to a design build, finance, operate, and maintain are increasingly being seen as a way to shift those risks from the public sector to the private sector contractor, and also to make sure that you're getting the value over a long period of time. Another thing to think about when you're talking about a finance approach to P3, if you're doing it as a pay-as-you-go project, then you're paying the contractor for work as it is completed. In a DBFOM, the contractor or your development partner is paying those costs upfront themselves and eating those costs over the course of the project. So by the time the public agency actually pays for that work, you are well into the process of delivering that project, sometimes all the way into the beginning of the operations and maintenance phase. So although equity is expensive capital, as John noted earlier, if they have put their equity capital at risk for the construction life of the project and you're into the O&M phase before they begin to get their equity back, that is a really good way to keep your development partner on the hook. You can be pretty assured that they're going to do everything they can to deliver if you're still holding on to their equity capital. And I think that that is perhaps an undervalued reason for moving forward. You do need legal or legislative authority to make sure that you can do alternative delivery. Not all public agencies have that. Many do, but not all do. So it's important to make sure that you have that capability. Arizona's P3 law was passed in 2009. It's very flexible. We can do not only the vertical component of the highway, but also ancillary projects like lighting, and we can also do vertical. We can do buildings that are related to ADOT's operations by using this law. One thing to remember if you're thinking about P3s is to make sure that not only do you have the authority to engage in alternative delivery, but also that if there's a revenue component, for example, if you're collecting tolls or fees or rents or something from the outside, or you're pocketing savings from the new facility, that you can use those revenues in support of the project, and that they don't just go into a general fund or something. So it's important to have somebody advising you who can think about those issues and make sure that you're well prepared. One more thing to note about ADOT's law is that it exempts us from the procurement code, which lets us do alternative delivery and make a selection based on something other than low bid, but we are not exempt from a competitive procurement process. So this is an open and public process where the selection criteria are clear, and so this sort of makes sure that there are no issues about backroom deals or questioning the validity of the procurement. And that sort of leads into this next slide, which is the fact that P3s can be controversial, and that sometimes they are rejected for reasons that aren't really valid. Again, people assume that a P3 is the privatization of a project, that you're basically turning over public control to the private sector. So either that it's an asset sale, that it's the privatization of a public sale, that there's been some sort of backroom deal being done, that developers are earning excessive profits as a result of doing this work. And also because, especially in transportation P3s, there are a lot of foreign entities that are concessionaires, foreign-owned entities that are concessionaires, a huge Spanish, Canadian, and Australian presence in the US market, and somehow that makes people even more nervous about this whole process. Even though those things are not true, they can and have cut short a lot of deals. So there are ways to make sure that those issues don't particularly impact you. And that is, again, to make sure that it is clear to the public what the agency's legal authority is, and that you are using the legal authority and that there is a competitive element to the process. That the process is clear, that there are off-ramps, that is, that if the deal is not working out, that the ability to end the deal is quite clear and can be exercised by the public sector without undue, there being an undue cost associated with that. That you are constantly communicating from the early days when you are considering the project all the way through into the operations and maintenance phase, that there is a communication with the public and that the public can access information about the project. You need to engage in regular briefings up your chain of command, including the elected officials, so that, again, they know from the very beginning when you're beginning to consider a project all the way through what the status of the project is, who your private partner is, how they were selected. That you highlight the risk transfer and value for money elements of this, that while the upfront cost may be more expensive than on a low bid, that you're saving money over the life of the project. And you also need to make sure that, of course, that as you would in any project, that it is linked to your agency and community priorities and values, that you're doing projects that need to be accomplished, and that this is an improved way to deliver the project and not some crazy methodology. So P3 at its heart is really about how to procure and deliver a project. So let me talk a little bit about how P3s might be a little bit different. First of all, you need to, as has been mentioned, you need to run a value for money assessment to help determine the value of the P3 over the entire life of the project. And you may determine as a course of this that private finance is in fact the best way to deliver this project. But as both John and Mike have mentioned, it's finance, it's not funding, it's not free money. You need to pay it back. There needs to be a revenue source, and all those revenue sources need to be built into your value for money analysis so that it is really clear that you are doing this in a way that delivers the project most effectively and efficiency over the life of the project. You can use a wide variety of revenue sources, everything from your regular budget and appropriations to tolls and highway land, or user fees, as I mentioned, taxes that are generated during the life of the project, kind of a TIF approach, or savings that come from replacing outdated facilities. All of those things can be used as revenue sources to go into the project, and the value for money process helps you determine that. Once you have made the decision, P3s are generally two-step processes, not always, where you conduct a request for qualifications, and then you shortlist a team, and then you go through the RFP process with your shortlisted teams. During the RFQ phase, because you're using a different procurement methodology, you're not just looking at their paper qualifications, but you were looking at the entire team that they are offering up to you: design, build, quality control, finance, and the long-term maintenance and operations team. So you're selecting the whole team, and you are able to make a qualifications-based selection based on their overall approach to the project and the way the team fits into the project, and not just on sort of paper qualifications. That is what they've done in the past, although that is still an important component. Then during the RFP process, you are actually engaging with your shortlisted teams, usually 3 to 5 shortlisted teams. You're engaging with them. You give them a draft of the RFP. You get their input into the long-term contract. In some cases, they can even give you suggestions. We call them alternative technical concepts for how to approach the project differently. Those alternative technical concepts can actually be purchased by the public agency, and they can be used even if that particular team doesn't win the bid in the long run. You can buy the idea from them and use it and bring it into the ultimate RFP, the ultimate contract. So it's a very, I just lost my screen here, sorry. Okay, somebody may need to help me out here. I just lost my screen. Okay, I apologize. I'll try and keep going. You can use those even if you can use those ideas regardless of who ultimately gets the project. And so the RFP process is quite unique and quite helpful, actually, based on traditional RFP. And IEDC helper, can somebody possibly advance the slides for me going forward, because for some reason my screen has gone dark and I'm not quite sure what happened. So if you can do that for me, and if someone can let me know when the slide has been advanced, and I'll just ask you when to do it. I don't know.
It's advanced now.
Sorry, I'll have to ask you and you'll have to tell me. Luckily I have a hard copy in front of me, but I've had a technical breakdown here. The next slide is about unsolicited proposals. This is also a unique aspect of P3s, is that you have the opportunity to invite private partners to look at what might be in your long-term plans and say, we have an idea for this project and how to deliver it more effectively, and we'd like to come talk to you about that. Many firms that do P3s do allow unsolicited proposals. In fact, at ADOT, we have done a P3 using as a result of an unsolicited proposal. The firm that makes the unsolicited proposal, the ideas still get competitively procured. There is no guarantee that they are going to win the proposal, but it's worth it to them to advance the idea, and it's another way of bringing the private sector into the process earlier, and can have some real advantages to encouraging your agency to think about projects in a way that they might not have thought about them otherwise. Okay, ready for the next slide, please. I'd like to talk now about a couple of projects that ADOT has underway in which we are successfully using the P3 process to deliver a variety of projects, just so you can see the variety, even within a transportation agency, the variety of projects in which P3s can be procured. We are in the process of doing LED lighting throughout our metropolitan Phoenix area. It's 119,000 fixtures, which is a lot of LEDs, a lot of fixtures. We are doing this using a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain approach. We have shortlisted down to 3 firms, and we are beginning the RFP process with these 3 firms at the end of this month. A value for money process showed that using private finance was actually going to be the most cost-effective way to engage in this process. I know that that isn't always the case, but in this case it was. We're very excited to be able to do our first DBFOM project, and we are using a variety of revenue sources for this project, including, and yay, my screen is back. Okay, thank you all for your help. Excited to be able to do our first DBFOM project. This will be a 2 to 3 year design and construction period in which we are going to replace all of the fixtures throughout the Metro Phoenix area. There is an opportunity for the provider to do some redesign, that is, take away some light poles and move them around if they think they can gain long-term efficiency from doing that, but it's not mandatory. It is it's their option about how to approach the project. And then that'll be followed by a 15-year maintenance period. And then another unique element of a P3 like this is that we are going to define the handback conditions. So at the end of 15 years, they're going to have to deliver a process back, the lighting system back to us in a way that meets our needs and requirements, and that'll be determined. Okay, now that I've asked you to advance the slides for me and have my slides back, I can't do it myself. Thank you very much. We received 8 responses to our request for qualifications. So that's a pretty good indication to me that the market is interested in these types of projects and that you're going to get a lot of competitive, good competitive responses. And as I said, we are expected to award a contract in the summer of 2018 and achieve commercial close by the November 1st, 2018. So that's a pretty exciting and busy 2018 for us. Next slide, please. The South Mountain Freeway is a traditional greenfield urban freeway process. 22 miles of new urban freeway. It's been long in the planning stages in Metro Phoenix. Was originally planned to be built as a traditional design bid build 9 separate segments, but we received an unsolicited proposal saying, why don't you do this as a design, build, operate, and maintain project and award the entire 22 miles to one team to deliver. We explored that opportunity. We ran a value for money process. We found that although private finance would probably have been an effective way to deliver this project because it was such a big and important project to ADOT, and because it was going to be our first P3 highway project, that was a risk we weren't quite willing to take yet. I think if we were doing it today, we might have gone forward, but we didn't, and that's good. We're happy about what we've got. And it's underway right now, being delivered by a team. We are going to come in, compared to what was planned for this project on a design bid build, we're going to deliver it 18 months ahead of schedule, and we're going to save about $500,000 on a $2 billion project. So that's pretty exciting. And the alternative technical concepts came into play as a part of this procurement. One thing that they suggested was that the structures, bridges along the project, that they all be designed, the whole project be designed in a way that all of the girders that hold up the bridges could all be the same, and then they could mass produce the girders, and that's responsible for probably $200,000 worth of the savings that I just mentioned. And that's something we would never have come up with had we not gone about it using this kind of process. There we go. Again, you can also do vertical facilities for a highway agency. We are building new office space in Flagstaff, Arizona. We had great commercial property that was very underutilized by having a little ADOT office there. So we were able to use this process to engage in a land swap between the city of Flagstaff, ADOT, and the private developer, so that we're moving into a repurposed movie theater for an unused repurposed movie theater for our new office space. And the city is going to get student housing right across the street from Northern Arizona University and new retail on our old property. It's not costing ADOT anything to move, except we're donating the value of our land. And the city's going to get a lot of additional tax revenue as a result of this swap. So it's been a very challenging project, but it is indicative of how you can use P3s in a very creative way. Lessons learned, if I could give you some advice if you're thinking about this. One question is, how much do you really know about yourself? Do you know how capable you are in delivering facilities? Do you know how much you're spending on facilities? You really need to understand a lot about yourself so that you can give a public sector kind of comparison to doing a P3. That's very important, and I think you'll be unpleasantly surprised to find out how little you may know about the way you really run and operate your facilities. I know that that has been true for us as well. Understand your funding options. Again, straight cost may not be the whole story. It's the life cycle costs that count. You need to be able to account for that. The value of the private sector's ideas, such as with unsolicited proposals and alternative technical concepts, can be an amazing driver for this process. And you also need to understand how you traditionally deliver other facilities and how you're going to fit this alternative delivery process into your existing, how you're going to fit this alternative process into your existing facilities and your existing delivery process. And I think you're ready for a P3 if you know you have the clear authority, you have a buy-in from your leadership, you have either experienced staff or outside consultants that you trust that can assist you with the project selection and value for money process. And if you can figure out how to do this either within or in parallel to your normal project delivery process. And those are 4 really big time-consuming things to only take up one slide, but there you go. And finally, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate it very much, and I hope it was helpful.
Great, thank you, Gail. Appreciate that. That was great. I have a whole bunch of questions here, and I get them out in just a minute. I'll just remind people that if they do have any questions, to put them down, type them down in that question box. So the first question is, are associated cost differences due to bypassing the prevailing wage requirements often associated with public projects, or primarily due to private-based project management expertise? And I'll leave that up to either of you to answer.
This is Gail. In our case, we do not exempt the P3 process or do not exempt P3 contractors or providers from any of the laws and regarding prevailing wage or safety. There are no exemptions to any of those laws in our standpoint. Now, ADOT is a right to work state, so we don't have all of the same constraints that highly unionized states have, but there are no shortcuts for us for P3 providers.
In my 28 projects that we've completed, they've all been prevailing wage projects. These are very complicated. These are laboratories, they're high-rise office buildings, they're city halls. Labor is not a big issue. You need skilled labor, whether it's union or not union, it is skilled labor. The savings that you can achieve from a P3 delivery is really, as I mentioned earlier, time related, and it's decision-making related. If you think of a normal public delivery of a project, you will see public agencies sort of feeling obligated to bring in someone from the mayor's office, the city manager, or the council, from the finance, the facilities, just important people from multiple disciplines within a government. And those kinds of meetings, often augmented with consultants, take a lot of time to schedule. It is normal for public delivery to take 20, 30, 40% longer to deliver than private delivery. So the savings is not avoiding prevailing wage. We pay prevailing wage. The savings is efficiency, shortening the delivery time.
Thank you. Next question is, what is the approximate % of the lease that covers repair and replacement costs?
It varies in whether you have a availability payment or a performance-based concept or a more conventional private operating maintenance. The O&M usually starts out as a dollar amount per square foot, and it ramps up a little bit over time because the building gets older. A recent facility we built, we assessed 60 cents per square foot into the operation and maintenance reserve. That's not for the thing that's, let me make it clear, it's not the operations costs. The operation costs are a direct pass-through for utilities, for janitorial and that. The maintenance and repair reserve is usually starts out at 60 cents. Every 5 years, we do an assessment of the building to see if the funds in that repair and replacement reserve are sufficient to replace the roof when it when the warranty matures and the roof needs to be repaired or any other element of the building. And every successive 5 years, we do a new study whenever we turn the building back to the governmental entity. Those funds in the repair and maintenance reserve go with the building back to the public agency. So it's just a series of studies assessing the components of the building and their projected needs for replacement or repair.
Gail, do you have a response to that?
No, because we have done different kinds of projects so far, and in a bit of a different environment than what John's describing. So I think I'm going to let his answer stand for now. Thank you.
Okay. John, this one's for you. Washington, like many other states, has public works rules. Are P3s with a long-term lease subject to public works rules?
In Washington, if it is privately owned on behalf of not-for-profit, if it's privately financed by the not-for-profit borrowing money to build it, and if it's privately constructed, it is not a public work in that sense. The answer to that question varies state by state and often jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but since your question was specific to Washington, the answer is no, it is not subject to public works. It is, interestingly, back to the first question, any building in Washington state that is built or leased to a local government, state, county, city, requires that if it's 50% occupied by that government, it requires that it be a prevailing wage. So the distinction, which is often not appreciated, and I think the questionnaire did appreciate it, there is a difference between prevailing wage and public works. And so in Washington, our approach is not subject to public works, it is subject to prevailing wage.
Okay, thank you. Gail, a question came up. Are you able to provide examples of how you applied P3 to Arizona DOT? And I think you've done that. But the next question related to that is, do the three firms for the LED example you gave involve your local electric company in any way?
Yes, as you can imagine. Now, the firms per se did not. The teams are for the design and construction, and then for the long-term operations and maintenance of the lighting. Some of the teams actually suggested a provider of the bulbs, the fixtures. Some did not, and we didn't require that. It was at their option to do so or not. All of them do have to interact with the two local utilities that provide the electricity on our system. That is definitely a complicating factor, and we are going to introduce, now that we have a short list of 3, we are going to introduce them to our two utilities, and we're going to sit down together with the 3 firms, the utilities, and with ADOT to try and get their questions answered. Many of our lights right now are not even metered. We pay a flat fee. And we're quite convinced, having looked at what we're paying, that we are overpaying for electricity by quite a bit. So the combination of getting the right rate structure in place and the reduction of consumption, electricity consumption, I think are going to result in a pretty hefty savings. We're expecting to save about 1/3 of our current utility costs on an annual basis. So that's a pretty substantial savings, and interaction with the utilities will be a critical component of that. And expertise in dealing with utilities is one of the things that we look for in our RFQ.
Thank you. So John, who tends to purchase the tax-exempt bonds? Are banks involved in the financing of P3s?
Banks do. Mostly it is private funds that purchase them. And it's And selling them is not an issue. For those that haven't been involved in this, the sale process, once you get the documents in place, is really quite simple. But yes, the answer is banks do purchase. More often than not, it's private investment funds that purchase. We use generally a negotiated sale with a national underwriter, Citi, Barclays, those kinds of underwriters.
Okay, thank you. So here comes the biggie, and I'll open up to both of you on this one. Do you know if any P3 projects have failed, and what were the consequences?
You want to do it first, Gail? Or do you want
sure.
me to?
Yeah, I'll jump in on the failure. Luckily, we haven't had one yet. So, but you always have to be aware of the possibility. Probably the most visible failures per se have been on the toll road side. There is a famous one in Texas called the Trans-Texas Corridor that was really a plan for a toll road to do as it sounds, to cut all the way across Texas. That was a political failure because unfortunately someone produced a map that showed this giant swath of highway cutting across the middle of Texas, and all of the farmers and ranchers sort of lost their minds about it, and I understand why they did. So that was pulled back for political reasons. There have also been, and I don't mean to pick on Texas here, but there has also been a financial failure. That would be the State Highway 130 in Texas, which was to be a revenue risk project that was bid quite aggressively, and it for more in a more rural, that included traversing a more rural area of Texas, and they were simply overly optimistic on the traffic side, and the revenue did not materialize. So that project has been handed back to TxDOT. Similarly, well, some time ago in San Diego, there was a failed revenue risk toll project. And again, the private contractor dropped out of that project, but they gave the project back to the Metropolitan Planning Organization in Southern California, in San Diego, and they got the value of a almost fully completed project for pennies on the dollar that they were then able to pick up and operate. So the two most visible failures have still resulted in the loser really being the private sector that made the bid and not the public sector. They got the value of an asset for a very low cost that they were then able to pick up and deliver. So on the transportation side, at least, though there have certainly been failures, they have mostly been beneficial to the private sector, even though they didn't turn out as originally planned. And John, I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. I totally agree with Gail. Most, if not all, of the P3 failures in a financial sense deal with sort of what I tend to call privatization, which is private building, toll roads, and demand revenue-based projects. Toll roads, parking meters, privately operated parking garages, and that kind of thing, where the facility isn't leased back to government, but where the private sector finances it, builds it, and collects the revenue. They could pay, depending on the structure, a portion of the revenue to the government or not, depending on how it's financed. But it is those sort of speculative P3 projects that have failed, and they're fairly, given the volume of P3 in the nation on those kinds of speculative projects, there's a fairly significant number of failures in various senses financially. They are Sometimes they result in the government taking them back and turning it into a public win, as Gail mentioned. But it is almost always the horizontal infrastructure that has failed. The vertical infrastructure, where facilities or the P3 structure leases back to a government, there are no financial failures. There are a couple projects that I put in the category of benefit failures, where the ultimate project ended up without delivering the hoped for savings to government. That's not always easy to determine, because the savings should be an over time savings, but zero failures in the vertical infrastructure that I'm aware of.
Thank you. We're running out of time here, so I just took time for a couple of quick questions. Have either of you begun to sort of been working on projects that have begun to address smart city applications in terms of digital communication technology, smart street lights, or safety cameras? Are you seeing any of these being done in the P3 world?
I think that's more in your world, Gail.
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, we are beginning to see some of that. It's pretty new. Our little mini version of wading into this will be that we're going to put a monitoring and control system on the new freeway lights as we put them up, so that we will be able to tell from a central office when lights are out, whether it's a single light or a whole circuit. And in this case, because they're being privately maintained, the private partner will also be able to tell when lights go out. And that will make it very easy for us to make sure that they're meeting their performance requirements, because we'll have a record that says the lights were out for 72 hours and your contract says they can only be out for 48 hours. So we're able to then deduct that from their payment. So it will be beneficial to us, beneficial to them, but also from a safety perspective, that's the reason you have highway lights, is so that people can see. And if the lights are out for an extended period of time, then that is definitely a safety failure. So that same kind of monitoring and control technology can also be used for ramp lighting, for signals, and can be used in an urban environment as well. So I am hearing a lot of talk about projects like that are going to be done using a P3 approach, because of the integration of the infrastructure with the technology, which can be challenging, I think, for public agencies to figure that out sometimes. So I think that's a real potential area of interest in P3 world that could have a lot of potential, and could also be a way to maybe speed up the deployment of some of these kind of projects, because you can deploy them through the P3 process in a way you might not be able to do that with traditional public procurement.
Thanks, Gail. We have one question. I think it's probably maybe the last one. Private delivery of public facilities is certainly getting a lot of attention recently and is more common of the P3 models, but public investments in private facilities are also commonly used in economic development. Are we going to discuss that other model? And the answer to that is no, we're not going to discuss that, but because it's not a traditional private-public partnership as we talk about in the delivery of procurement and financing for public facilities. Now, that's sort of more of an inversion of a P3, and that's what we do here at ADA. We are a development finance authority, and we use our public dollars, and we help deploy capital into the private sector to develop private facilities, private infrastructure, private buildings, and all the rest of it, so that there is an economic development piece attached to that. So no, we're not going to talk about it during this, because it's not the type of P3 we're talking about, but it is kind of an inversion of that model. It is a public-private partnership, but of a different type. So no, I'd be happy to talk with you offline about that, but that's not part of what we have going today. So thanks very much, John and Gail. Really appreciate you joining us today. Do you guys either have any final remarks?
Just delighted
final
to be
remark.
here, and very, I think anyone that wants to, I think our information is available. If you want to offline contact us, feel free to do. So thank you all. Gail?
Yeah, thank you, John. I was about to make the same offer. If there are any follow-up questions that anybody has, I'm more than happy to address them. And I also want to thank you all for your patience during my little technical glitch too. So thank you.
I thought you came through that heroically. That was a horrible thing to happen.
Thank you.
And I just want to remind everyone that you will be receiving an email in the next 24 hours for evaluation of the webinar. Please complete that, and from there you'll get a link to the presentations. Recordings of the presentation, of this whole presentation, are available from the IEDC bookstore. There is another webinar coming up. There it is. Corporate social responsibility and economic development. You can visit IEDC's website where you can sign up for this and other upcoming webinars. Again, I thank everyone for being here today. Have a great day, and good luck with your P3 projects. Thank you.